everyone. Welcome to this week's stream of web performance and CDN. And also, sometimes we talk about SEO. Today, I've got a wonderful guest, Leonie Watson. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yes, you did. Hello.
Hello, welcome again. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today. And Leonie is a director at Tetralogical. I think she
Mhm.
runs her own agency, but she's also the chair of the W3C Board of Directors and co-chair of the W3C Web Applications Working Group, which is an feels like an honor to have somebody of that caliber with me on this little live stream. Yeah.
No,
Uh,
it all sounds an awful lot grander than it is, trust me.
Hopefully. But I think there's a lot to Leonie, and uh, maybe I give her a chance to introduce herself a bit better than I would do. So, do you mind, Leonie?
No, not at all. And thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast. So I'm Léonie Watson, and my background is in accessibility. I started off life actually as a web designer back in the 90s. Lost my sight around about the turn of the century, and then by accident came across this thing called accessibility, which is really all about pulling things apart to find out why they don't work for everybody and trying to work out how to put them back together in ways that do mean they work for people who are blind like myself, neurodivergent, people who don't hear so well, move so well, whatever it may be. And that's what I've been doing really for the last 20, 25 years. And the nice thing about it is that it leads me into all sorts of kind of side areas of interest, like, the reason I'm here, why in how accessibility intersects with performance and things like that. So that's, yeah, a little bit about me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Uh, for me, I don't know so much about accessibility because unfortunately, most places I work didn't care so much about that, and it
It
didn't
happens.
come to my attention. So but now, having this live stream and also being curious about a lot of things, I thought might be a perfect time to, talk to people, learn a lot of different stuff, and help other people as well while I'm learning through the live stream. So it's a pleasure. We have someone on the live stream who says he's glad to hear a session he enjoys because he's also a designer, and most time I've been talking very technical web performance topic. So feels good to have something different than the usual. So awesome. So I think a nice way I would like to start, given how you've described, I think you said 20 years in the industry, and would like to know, like, for you, starting as a designer and now working with a W3C, how have you seen like the web change throughout your career? Especially recently with AI, maybe you use it, maybe not. But and also, what are you most excited about?
Sure. I mean, the web has changed a lot since, the early mid 90s. And when I say web designer, that was the term back then that we used for the person who did the front end, the code, the design, they did the back end, uploaded everything to the server. So it was a term that kind of meant, I guess the closest we call it these days would be full stack, because you
Ah,
looked after literally everything. So I'm not a designer in the kind of sense that we think about it now, and
I
certainly
see.
not since I lost my sight. But yeah, as I say, that's one of the biggest changes is back then you had one, maybe two people, and they did a lot, everything. Uh, Obviously, now we have people who specialize in different bits of the stack because there's a lot more to think about. We had JavaScript frameworks came along, they changed everything. Uh, Performance at some point, it started to be a thing that people thought about. SEO is another thing that kind of came along somewhere in the years. So yeah, a great deal has changed. And you mentioned AI, that's starting to have the same effect now. Perhaps not so much of an impact yet, anyway, on the kind of the design and coding part of it. We're certainly seeing a huge and not terribly good impact in terms of content. A lot of AI generated written content is yeah out there now, and it's pretty dismal, pretty
Yeah.
terrible stuff. But AI, I think, is proving useful in other ways. The trick, I think, is just not to depend on it. Use it as a way to kind of think through ideas, get some ideas, remind yourself of something you know. That's one thing I do use it for. It's like, oh, what's that attribute? What's that method? I knew it. And you can use, these AI tools to help you
Yeah,
co-complete that and then remember stuff. So for things like that, I think it's fine as long as you remember that you can't entirely trust it any more than, to be honest, you can entirely trust anything you find on the web anywhere.
yeah,
It's there's a bit of a thing at the moment, around AI that we sort of seem to be comparing it to some golden standard that has never existed. Just
yeah.
because you search for something and you get a blog post telling you how to do a thing does not mean that that blog post is anyway, accurate or useful or,
True.
even relevant. So keep that in mind. I mean, I will say for a blind person, though, AI, generative AI, is hugely exciting because it enables me to describe things, get things described. I just got a pair of Meta Ray-Ban smart
Oh,
glasses with AI. So I can now wear a pair of glasses, just look at something and ask it to describe what it sees, which is extraordinary. For the first time in 25 years, I can more or less kind of look at a thing and get some idea of what it is. That's been possible on my phone for a while, but it meant having to take my phone out of my pocket, unlock it, find the app, point my camera at a thing, you know, which is
so
lovely. It was really useful, don't get me wrong, but having that with a
yeah,
pair of glasses now is just so much more convenient. So I find myself in a real difficult situation because, I'm really aware of the bad climate impact generative AI is having. I know it's not reliable, it's doing a lot of bad stuff, but
there's some good.
also doing some pretty damn good stuff from my point of view. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's tricky. So
Yes.
yeah, lots changed in 20 25 years or more.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think AI is also, I mean, like you said, the good parts, the bad parts, and you instead of trying to, use it to generate a lot of maybe blog posts that you can't fact check if it's correct or not, but just to do for SEO and on the other end, it's useful for a lot of other things that I think also
Right.
regarding like some kind of cancer procedures or some things. I think there have been
Hmm.
some reports about how it makes those medical decision making faster and all. And
Right.
I hope we get on the better end than on the bad end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope so too. Definitely.
But since most people are more excited about AGI and having robots wash out dishes and all, yeah.
Yes,
But
if I get a robot to make me a good cup of tea, then I think we'll have succeeded.
yeah, well, maybe we get there. Yeah, cool. So I have a few questions here that I kind of prepared to guide the conversation, but I may not necessarily go through everything. And but there's also listener, so if anyone in the audience have questions, feel free to drop in the chat. We try to get it in. And today's stream might be shorter than usual because I'm using the free Zoom version, which is 40 minutes. So I try to get it going faster. So my
Yeah.
first question will be around optimizing page speed. And I'm curious, so how does page speed, using things like Core Web Vitals affect accessibility? Because I'm curious how optimizing for that could improve accessibility and improve page speed, or maybe on the other hand, optimize it for Core Web Vitals or overdoing that could also affect accessibility negatively. What do you think? What are your opinions?
So I think if we think about accessibility as it really is relevant to people using assistive technology. So for people tuning in who are not familiar, an assistive technology is something that someone with a disability will use to assist them as they use technology. So for a blind person like me, it's a screen reader and it speaks more or less what's on screen because obviously I can't see what's there. Um, so I'm not going to talk about accessibility in terms of color contrast and the kind of the design sort of visual elements, if you see what I mean. But really, and sorry to your designer who was hoping for a less technical conversation earlier, but this really is kind of relevant at the code level and the structural level. Um, the good news is that in that aspect of accessibility, the more you can do whether it's kind of core vitals or anything else to improve your performance, there's every chance it'll be doing really good things for accessibility. Or to put it another way, the worse your performance is, the worse it's going to be for accessibility, because and this takes a bit of explaining. Everything that the browser does, there's a bit more it has to do if someone's running an assistive technology like a screen reader. So what is, maybe a little bit of bad performance for most people, time to paint, time to interact, whatever, you can pretty much guarantee that it will be a little bit more worse for somebody who's using an assistive technology, because the browser's just got to do a bit more work, you know, on the other end of the, the critical path and things like that. So yeah, they're very tightly related. The better your performance, the better your experience for accessibility will be too.
Oh, you see. And so that means also focusing on improving it for to make it accessible to more folks means also you are getting better web performance. Because also in terms of SEO, probably I think like they measure this if it's slow or if it behaves this way.
Mhm.
How much users drop or don't engage with your site. And I think if you also considered some disabled people that need access to your website, if they also can't use it, it also affects how Google tracks the interaction. So it makes it very vital as well, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And all these things, as I'm sure you and all your listeners are very well aware of, they're all quite tightly related. You've got to get, all things right. You've got to get your kind of the amount of code that you use, the JavaScript that you're loading in, you want to keep that as minimal and lean as possible. You want to get, things like your SEO right, but you just want to make sure everything is as optimized as you possibly can in as many dimensions as you can. And the more you can do that, as I say, the better an impact it will
Yeah,
have on the accessibility end of things. Absolutely.
yeah,
It
and
might help perhaps to just sort of explain a bit about what I mean by kind of accessibility, having the browsers do a bit more work.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, bear with me here because this does take a little bit of explaining, but
no
I'll
worries.
trust that you're all kind of pretty familiar with the standard sort of critical rendering path. So you load up a document, the HTML gets passed, browser starts to build the DOM. If the HTML then calls in any CSS or JavaScript and that has any kind of impact on the DOM, then it'll start re-architecting the DOM. At some point, the CSS and the DOM will be brought together and you've kind of got your rendering model. And eventually, right at the end of that pathway, you come to paint and the point at which most people can start looking and interacting with something. When you've got a screen reader or an assistive technology running, there's another thing that's going on in the background, and that's the creation of another structure called the accessibility tree.
Yeah,
And all browsers do it slightly different point along that kind of critical path. But more or less, they start building the accessibility tree at about the time they start building the DOM. So anything after that point that triggers a change in the DOM architecture also causes change in the accessibility tree architecture. So if you're using a browser and say a screen reader, your browser's doing that extra kind of work at the same time it's doing the critical rendering path. So it's having to work harder. So the more time, say, you call in a lot of extra JavaScript and you increase the chance that that JavaScript is re-architecting the DOM before it's rendered fully, it's also then making the browser re-architect the accessibility tree. And this is why I kind of said, so, the more efficient you make your process in the most basic sense uh, of performance,
yeah,
the lighter the kind of the load for doing the accessibility tree rendering comes for the browser. And that means the quicker I get to my version of Paint, which is probably, I don't know, vocalize, speak, something like that. Because, yeah, me personally, I don't care so much when all the pixels and stuff appear on the screen and I can start clicking. What I do care is when the accessibility tree is built and my screen reader can start querying it using the platform APIs that are available to it. And then I can start hearing what content is available and interacting with it. So, yeah, there's more work to be done if you're a user with those kind of technologies running. And so, yeah, anything you can do that's good for performance generally will be good for accessibility performance too.
yeah. I'm curious about this, the accessibility tree and how it relates to the DOM. So you
Mhm.
describe how the rendering happens. You said also that browsers do it differently, but for the most common browser, does it kind of do this immediately after rendering the DOM and then reacts always when something changes in the DOM, or also reacts to JavaScript events?
Sure, a little of all of it. So the accessibility tree is basically a sister structure to the DOM in the sense that everything that's in the DOM will be in the accessibility tree. But what's in the accessibility tree is just what we call accessibility semantic information. So lots of HTML elements that end up in the DOM have 2 or 3 bits of accessibility semantic information about them. The role, which is what they do. So if I take a button, it's always the favorite example, button element, when that appears in the accessibility tree, that will tell assistive technologies that this thing has a role of button, just what it is, basically. It'll have an accessible name. So usually for a button, that's the thing that appears between the opening and closing button HTML tags. And possibly in some cases, it'll have some information about its state. So radio button, for example, might be selected or not selected.
Yeah.
So essentially everything that's in the DOM appears in the accessibility tree. So if you then go and remove something from the DOM, perhaps you've just applied to, display none to it, for example, that then needs that bit of the DOM to be rebuilt. That means that bit of the accessibility tree needs to be rebuilt so that that element, that node doesn't show up anymore. So as I say, the DOM and the accessibility tree are very, very closely related. And then you've got an additional technology that you can use called ARIA. It's accessible rich internet applications. And that's a set of attributes that you can use and you can apply them directly in your HTML, or more commonly, people use JavaScript to apply them. Uh, and these can add accessibility semantics where none exists in HTML natively. So it's pretty common these days for taking a span or a div and then building it into a custom component or a custom element that actually has some kind of functionality. So there's a role attribute, for example. So if we wanted to create a fake heading, we could take a span, give it a role attribute with a value of heading, do some more things to it besides that. And from an accessibility point of view, that would be essentially indistinguishable from an HTML heading element. But as I say, that's most commonly applied in the JavaScript. So if you get to the point in the rendering path where you just called some JavaScript and it's now applying some ARIA to your HTML, that changes the DOM, that changes the accessibility tree. And so the cascade kind of kicks off again for a slightly different reason.
Yeah. That's quite an interesting workflow. I haven't. I, I heard about this accessibility tree from your talk. I think it was 4 years ago at Web Performance in Amsterdam. So I was more
Mhm,
curious to hear about it in person. But that's quite something that maybe I also have to dig into deeper a bit later to learn more about how it works, because most times we build those apps and we don't really the most then you hear or I've heard was like, maybe add some area tags and
mhm.
accessibility tree. We didn't don't really think of how this affects other experiences. But
Right.
since
Yes.
browsers uh, they implement it differently, I'm curious, you're also on the W3C, but like why do you think they don't have like a standard across browsers? Maybe like things with Google, I think they have this baseline kind of tracking. And it would be nice, I think, to have that kind of standardized across browsers.
Mhm. So, I mean, in the terms of the exact way they build the accessibility tree, they're all a little bit different, but not, a huge amount. Um, it's really what you get out of the accessibility tree. So, a screen reader can use every operating system has what are known as platform accessibility APIs. They're not JavaScript APIs like we use in development. They're just available to applications in the OS. But they're what assistive technologies use to query the accessibility tree in the browser. and get all this information out. So it's how I know I'm looking at a heading or a table or a list, because my screen readers queried the browser and basically said, look, what is this thing? And got that semantic information back. There is tracking across how that information is exposed to assistive technologies. It's called the HTML Accessibility API Mappings Specification, or AAM. It's a bit of a mouthful. But there you can go and check out any HTML element, and it will tell you how it's exposed in different ways by different browsers. And again, they're pretty similar. In Safari with VoiceOver, the screen reader there, you might hear something as a graphic, whereas in Firefox or Chrome on Windows and a Windows screen reader, you might hear it's an image.
Okay.
But essentially, they both tell you the same thing.
Yeah.
So again, there are differences, but they're not staggeringly different. And unless you're, as a user, switching between browsers and contexts like that, which as a rule most people don't do too often, it's kind of fine. The question to ask is someone able to get the relevant information they need, rather than does it sound exactly like the browser on another
Okay.
device, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, I
so
see.
W3C is kind of tracking it, and recommends how these things should be done. After that, of course, it's down to the different implementers to make that happen, and they're doing a pretty good job by and large. All the browsers have a really good standard of accessibility. There's always more they could be doing, of course, but generally speaking, it's pretty good.
Yeah, awesome. I think it's quite an amazing work to work on the standards and try to get how things standardized across platform and be usable by most folks.
Mhm.
So kudos to you all who work with the in the W3C.
Thank you.
So we talked a bit about JavaScript, and um, I've used I use JavaScript frameworks a lot too, although not so much the past few months. But
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of applications built on React, maybe a bit with Angular, but I have more experience with React, and I know it does things like when it renders a form and you want to capture users' form inputs, it has this way of having like a controlled state, and each time you make have get an unchanged event in the from the keyboard, it sort of re-renders and sets the value of the field. And sometimes it gets misused by some people, and then you have like applications that lead to every kind of interactions renders almost every part of the web page. And I'm curious
Mhm.
for people that use assistive technologies, how this kind of impacts what they hear, or especially what they hear, because if you do a lot of changes and it keeps rendering and changing the DOM, I'm also assuming this could also trigger like a screen reader.
Right. Uh, I mean, the good news is about React applications is that, um, although it handles the DOM kind of differently, it doesn't stop the accessibility information being exposed to the APIs and to screen readers. So that at least isn't so much of a problem. What is a problem though is just the general performance of something like React. Um, it tends to get quite heavy-handed very easily. And going back to the earlier part of the conversation, anything that has a hit on performance in general, you will feel it much more if you happen to use a screen reader or an assistive technology. So in that sense, it's much less desirable. And you're right, sort of constantly reloading, rebuilding, rechanging things, it can be problematic if it's done too much. Um, the APIs, the platform accessibility APIs that I mentioned, they listen for change events that are triggered by things like, JavaScript rebuilding parts of the DOM, and every time they do that, like the browser itself, they've got to go away and kind of rethink about something, query the information, present it back to the user, uh, and all that is hard work in the browser. It's hard work for the screen reader. It's quite hard work as a user, depending on what's being changed and moved around. It's quite easy sometimes for something just to vanish, and you're completely unaware that it's vanished. Visually, something big has just disappeared, and you can see that that's happened. as a screen reader user, you may not know until you go back looking for that part of the page and suddenly discover it's not there. Or, the sort of reverse of that, particularly with single page applications,
Yeah.
you click on a link, it reloads, part of the viewport. Um, but in the process, that link you clicked on just vanishes. Suddenly it's not there anymore. But because the page hasn't loaded and you don't get all the kind of behaviors you're expecting when a new, full page has loaded, you can get lost really easily. Suddenly you're kind of a sea in this page, your focus has got lost. So you've got to kind of go exploring to sort of find out where you are, what's changed. So it's not the best of experiences, but I'm kind of reassured that there seems to be a bit of a kind of move to start rethinking, the kind of viability of React in a whole bunch of different ways as to whether it's actually lived up to all the promises.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, the growing suspicion seems to be it probably hasn't, unless you're kind of Meta and you've got many, many, many teams of people capable of dealing with it.
Yeah, I
But
think
yes,
it's interesting to see those conversations happening. And although I don't see, it doesn't look like it's still like a lot more work needs to be done to have that conversation on has it really lived up to, the promise of
mm,
to performance?
mhm,
Because also frameworks doubling down on it and then promising you speed by default because of the framework. And a lot
mm,
of people don't really think about how they use the framework. And I've
yeah,
also been in teams that I've seen how it gets used, and I get frustrated both as a user and sometimes as a programmer having to deal with, trying to think through the code base. And hopefully
mhm,
we get there where people pay more attention to these things and take it more serious.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. One of the accessibility problems we have seen, and it's not just React, although, because it's but certainly one of the most popular, some responsibility does lie with it, is that, as we've got into the past, what, decade, 15 years, where we've been able to use frameworks for kind of more rapid iteration, a lot of, the built-in kind of components, modules, features, and things, they're not good examples of accessible coding. So what gets rendered to the user, the actual HTML that gets chucked out by the browser, is not as good as it needs to be in accessibility terms. So, you know, a lot of stuff won't have the keyboard accessibility you'd get if you were using kind of native HTML, or, you know, I forget which one of the frameworks it is. It might be React. Sort of in the early days, certainly was a great one. They wouldn't use an anchor element. They just rebuild links completely from spans.
Oh,
You can't actually do that. You literally cannot build a fully functioning link as a custom, custom component or custom element. Browsers quite rightly stop you doing things like, which links have been visited, because security, privacy is important. Um, and that's a shame, because what's happened is it meant that developers, because they're concentrating on using the frameworks, have kind of moved away from where I began, which was actually, writing the HTML, the JavaScript by
yeah,
hand yourself, have lost the understanding of the semantics I was talking about before. You know what a heading is because the heading element has that role,
yeah,
uh, and nobody knows how to fix it. The people who are responsible for the frameworks are not doing what they need to make their frameworks render accessible HTML. Developers have got out of the habit of writing HTML for themselves and have lost the kind of understanding of why semantic information is so important. This is why accessibility people are just hanging on the whole time. Write HTML, understand HTML.
yeah.
But the
So
problem is the industry's moved on from that, and that's not what developers are learning or are trained to learn anymore. And
ex-
so we've got this knowledge gap that we
ex-
can't solve. We kind of need the frameworks to solve it.
exactly. Yeah,
And developers do, and we keep, accessibility people keep blaming the developers. It's not your fault either. It's because, this is how things have gone, and you just moved away, and that knowledge has got lost. But, you have to use the tools that are kind of out there, being
yeah.
chosen by the people in your organization, or whatever. So yeah, that is one problem that all these things collectively have kind of caused, unfortunately.
And also, if you take like boot camps and you get taught front end development or web development, you get
Mhm.
taught React, and that's they teach you from the perspective of learning
Right.
React's APIs and not web APIs or the
Mhm.
web platform APIs. So you have developers that just know the React bit, but don't really know why or it's good or
Yeah.
not good to use. And
Mhm.
that's also the problem. I see this all with, like you said, with accessibility, but also with things like system design or
Mhm.
engineering in general, and people don't really know how things work beyond React. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's quite,
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe to say sad to see, but I hope we retract our steps and we're able to find a good ground
Mhm.
to pass on better information. And my job also doing this live stream is to hopefully learn and also get people to learn that there are better ways to do things. Yeah,
Absolutely. And to demand better, I think that's the other thing,
yeah,
all these companies, the open source community projects, whoever they are, that are responsible for these frameworks. Developers should be able to trust that the tools they're using have got this stuff.
yeah,
It shouldn't really fall to developers unless you're really kind of, customizing or extending what these frameworks can do. But if you're just using a standard module or, standard component, you should be able to trust that that tool's got your back for accessibility, privacy, security, whatever. Um, but as a developer, if you don't understand what's missing, you can't insist that the framework providers, give it to you.
yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. I hope we kind of, yeah, find a kind of nice time where we get the advantages of frameworks, but without the things I think we've lost a little bit.
Yeah, I'm kind of shifting towards the less frameworks part because most times they don't let me do when I realize how what they do and I don't want to go that direction. It
Hmm.
makes it hard to kind of take yourself out of it. And these days I'm
Right.
taking a different direction, which is not a popular opinion because then it's like you're doing something custom and everyone is doing something bespoke.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's quite a bit sad for me because we are almost running out of time with Zoom. It's like 2.5 minutes left, and
Okay.
uh, I don't want the call to just end halfway through the stream. But it's been a
Yeah.
wonderful conversation with you. You let me a lot. I still have maybe one or two questions, but probably that will be for another time in the future.
Well,
And
thank you so much. It's been a lot
yeah.
of fun doing this. And if there are any questions that came in and we didn't get a chance to answer them, feel free to email them over and I'm happy to try and answer them asynchronously.
Yeah, I will do. Thanks also for the listeners that joined in. Hopefully, we have also have the next two live stream next week and the week after will be also be on accessibility. So we get a chance to ask the next speaker some of my unanswered questions and maybe also get a new different perspective and you know uh, see you next week. In the meantime, if you have any question, leave it in the comments. Find Leonie on LinkedIn, also on as Leonie Watson. She was very kind to respond to my LinkedIn message, so I'm pleased to have her on board. And hope you have a good weekend and a nice, relaxed, Leonie.
You too.
Yeah. See you next week, listeners. Bye bye.